Welcome to episode 3 of VRTogether's Roundtable series, where we sit down with experts and guests leading the way in all things virtual reality and wellness. Be sure to subscribe for future episodes and sign up for our email list linked below to stay connected with our studio. With us today, as always, is VRTogether founder and CEO Richard Hoagland, along with our special guest, Dr. Jess Rushing. Dr. Rushing is a board-certified music therapist and assistant professor at Colorado State University. Dr. Rushing is currently the chair-elect of the American Congress of Rehabilitation Medicine Arts and Neuroscience Networking Group, and has served the American Music Therapy Association as a past chair of the Interprofessional Collaborative Resource Committee and on the Assembly of Delegates. She spent her career exploring the impact of music therapy across all stages of life, from premature infants to end-of-life care, and has collaborated with VRTogether on our app VR Singing Club, which is focused on creating joy and improving wellness through the power of music and virtual reality. Dr. Rushing, thank you so much for being here today.
Hi, it's nice to be here.
Yeah. So to start off, I would just love to hear a little bit about your background in music therapy, what brought you to that, and then what led you to focus your research on the intersection of music, health, and rehabilitation.
Sure. I guess I was lucky enough to hear about music therapy at the end of high school, and I happened to already be going to Florida State University as just one of the state school options in Florida where I lived, and it happened to be one of the best programs in the nation for the field of music therapy.
Nice.
So that really lucked out in landing there and then figuring out that's what I wanted to do and being able to start towards that as a freshman in college, because it's hard to know that that's a career option. So that's where I started. I went to Florida State for undergrad and got a degree in music therapy. And I did my internship in California at a big private practice in San Diego and got a lot of exposure to different ways of thinking and different types of populations, everything from medical to mental health to children to end of life. And then I got a master's in music therapy back at Florida State again and specialized in some more counseling approaches and worked with women with eating disorders and did a thesis on women who had experienced domestic violence, so leaning in towards the mental health side of things. And then I worked a lot in medical and private practice settings, and one of those was like neuro rehab. So I spent a fair amount of time working in that area, which combined with medical led me to the opportunity to be at UK Healthcare. And they had a PhD track in rehab sciences. So I was able to work at the hospital while I worked towards that degree program, and then focusing that work on stroke and neurorehabilitation.
Yeah.
But still with that mental health kind of slant. So like post-stroke depression being a challenging outcome, which makes sense. But so that's what I was looking at.
Yeah. So I'm interested, like for myself and for our viewers who maybe, have heard music therapy, that term before, what are some real life use cases of music in therapeutic senses? How is it utilized in a healthcare setting?
Yeah, one of the interesting things about our field is that we are trained as general practitioners, so similar to like a psychologist. Where they have tools that they can use to meet people, and then they might specialize in different areas, as opposed to like a physical therapist who very much works with physical outcomes, among many other things. But that's kind of one of the things that is confusing sometimes in the title of music therapist, where music is our tool as opposed to our target. So we can work in any settings, and some of my right now, for clinical training, I take students to the hospital once a week, and we work on the medical oncology unit. And we do a fair amount of work with psychosocial care, like mood, coping with diagnosis or situation, outlook, like improving the outlook of what's happening right now, helping normalize the hospital environment. It's so easy to just become a patient and everything's medical driven, and how do we fix you, if you will? and forgetting that humanizing side of things. So we live in that space a lot on that unit. We had a referral the other day for spiritual support. So while we're not chaplains or anything like that, we can be there with the patient, and church was really important to this person. So we sang hymns, and she spoke about like what that meant to her, and that's something that's regular in her life. She goes to the singing group at her nursing home twice a week. So we got to bring that piece of her life into her hospital care. The other thing I do right now from a clinical training perspective is I run a women's mental health drumming group. Some of the community members asked to have a space to process stuff in a different capacity that wasn't talk therapy. So using drumming to access some of those more primitive processes where sometimes trauma is stored in our bodies, or being able to work through process things and access things that doesn't always happen the same when you just talk about it.
Yeah. Do you find that music does that phrase that you use kind of the primitive aspects or some of that brain function? I mean, you can only do, I feel, so much in talk therapy. It's an incredibly important tool, big advocate for it. But music for me, is something that I consider very spiritual in a sense, even if it's not connected to a certain religion. Do you find that music does help you tap into some of that sort of somatic space with your patients or with any kind of care that you're giving?
Yeah, absolutely. And music automatically taps into our like brainstem areas and the lower like pre-cognitive processing. We move to music without having to think about what we're doing. We're already like thinking about what to anticipate as you're listening to the music because of the rhythmic structure or what we know in our Western tonality knowledge. We can just anticipate it. We know about it. So our brains are already processing it without having to think really hard about it. So then using that knowledge, we can create a space where there's more room to do the harder cognitive work.
I mean, yeah, that makes so much sense. I mean, music has been around since the beginning of human history. I feel like it is so intrinsic in us. So getting to see it used in a therapeutic setting as well is really, really interesting. So switching gears a little bit, but kind of still in that realm. You've worked with applying music in these clinical settings. You've worked with people of all ages. How has that experience shaped your approach? Working with children, or I can speak for myself. My 98-year-old great grandmother, she was a pianist her whole life, and really did. Her mental acuity was really good up until the end, and a big part of that was she played piano every single day. I mean, it was a skill and a part of her that I think really attributed to her mental well-being. So working with all these different ages, kind of how have those experiences shaped your approach in applying music therapy? I'd love to hear in a traditional sense, but then also in a VR setting as well, or using technology.
I guess age-wise, I mean, I think we're really lucky to be able to interact across generations. I think a lot of people these days are pretty isolated to their group of people or where they work, or we don't interact intergenerationally as maybe people did before. I know my generation, we all like moved away from our parents, and so don't have that like connection to it. So I mean, that's something I value from being a music therapist, is being able to interact with people from different generations, and occasionally have spaces where that comes together and people get to see that. I know the women in the group really value that there's no age. It's all adults, but there's no age limit. So we have people from 20 to 70s in that space, and they get to hear the different challenges that each other interact with and what they're thinking about, and find that sense of one of the powerful things about group work is a sense of universality, and that like maybe you're using different words to describe your challenge, but I have this one and that feels like we're together in something.
Yeah.
Can you, I'm curious just if you could share a bit more of what does it look like in the group drum circle session? Like,
Yeah, sure.
I'm imagining people each having a drum,
Mm-hmm.
playing rhythmically together, and then, but I'm also imagining that out of that is conversations.
Mm-hmm.
But that, I guess, and that immediately is like super intriguing. So
Yeah.
is it structured? Like, are there rhythmic I don't know, I guess musical rhythms that you all play? Yeah, I guess, like, how structured is it? Is it always follow the same way? It's just fascinating to me. And I am going to say this real quick, just because it was before we were on. It's so fascinating to hear all of the work that folks do, even collaborators that we have. Like, and it's also super impressive. I'm like, oh wow,
Oh, amazing.
that's a lot of cool stuff you're doing. But yeah, back to it. I'd love to hear some more about what a session looks like.
Sure. And you nailed it. Yeah, everybody's got a drum, and we use them. And there is a spectrum of how much structure we bring to the music making experience. As a facilitators, we're always ready. I say we because I have students who are learning in there with me how to facilitate it. We're always ready to support structure as needed, but then sometimes we just completely let it be open and see what happens. So we do everything from basic improvisation, where I start us with a beat or someone else does, and then people explore their own sounds on their drums, to like learning pre-composed rhythms and layers of rhythms that are like a specific known rhythm or rhythmic structure. So from both ends through that spectrum of improvisation to recreation, which are two of the main methods of music therapy practice. So for example, yesterday, one of the students led a polyrhythm where they taught them two different rhythms and we practiced playing them together.
Cool.
And then we also did, we practiced, one of the other students designed a more educational therapeutic music experience around the neurophysiology of like coping skills, and did as like body tapping technique and put music to it and had people experiment with that to see if it was something that was felt regulating to them. And then we talked about if it wasn't, when they might use that and what kind of space. And then we did but we sang a song together. First we sang and played Stuck in the Middle with You.
Love.
That's what we did first, actually. I forgot that piece. And then we all talked about our week, like where you at, how you doing. Some people reported out on like goals that they had achieved during the week that they talked about the week before. Some people talked about going to Women's Day marches. And then we had some extra time, so we did a much more free improvisational experience. And we did that for about 15 minutes where I didn't guide them much rhythmically, and just let it evolve. And probably about 10 minutes in, they started kind of taking charge of things and introducing new sounds. We have like a whole bunch of auxiliary instruments in the middle of the circle, and they can just use them at their will. And then they were like interacting with each other with the sounds, and a bunch of smiling and laughing. And then another big piece of yesterday was, and this speaks to our project, they really value singing, and a lot of them didn't know that they did. And then we've been doing more and more singing songs, just straight up singing songs, or exploring our voices. So the students designed an experience that helped them transition from just breathing to humming to audiating sound to playing within tones of a harmonic structure. And then we were all like singing and harmonizing together, and there was enough structure to explore the voices, but it wasn't like you have to do this thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then everyone was like, whoa, that was really neat. I like felt different in my body.
I'm really interested in drumming. I mean, drumming is something that, as I'm sure you know, has been utilized in a lot of community music rituals, ceremonial practices. I mean, from Indigenous Americans, Celtic, African groups, I mean, pretty much all over the world, drumming is very, I feel like, intrinsic to humanity, and especially in a community setting. Do you find that different instruments maybe evoke different modes of, I don't know, feeling, or kind of body awareness or body reactions?
The drums are nice because you don't have to have any sort of musical training to interact with it and create music that sounds like music. So I think that like the drums are a really awesome access point, and given that our bodies are so rhythmic, there's the kinesthetic connection that I think a lot of the people in my group appreciate, especially the ones that have trouble not being in their head. So that physical interaction with something is valuable.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think as far as like specific instruments, that's a benefit of the drums, is you can access them from a physical and a zero training perspective.
Yeah, that's really useful. And I love what you said about our bodies. Kind of, we are rhythmic beings. I mean, I think about our heartbeats. Like that for me is always what kind of group drumming sounds like. It's like a unified heartbeat, with all these other beats sprinkled in, kind of like the other parts of our body moving, and existing. That's, I'm sure, very powerful to witness in person as well and get to facilitate. So wanting to transition just a little bit more into our specific collaboration, Dr. Rushing, I'd love to hear from your point of view, or really from both of y'all, how the collaboration with our studio, VRTogether, how did that begin, and kind of what interested you about blending VR and music for therapeutic settings or for therapeutic uses?
I mean, how did we meet? We met through a mutual friend that was working with Richie, with Dima. I worked with a colleague at the hospital who knew about my interest in technology and advanced possibilities in advancing the field in that capacity. And she knew the fellows at VRTogether, and they were really interested in this space of older adults. And I think it was really, to me, it felt valuable that the folks in technology were spearheading the interest versus us saying, hey, I'd like to do something, and let me find some technology folks that might be able to do that with me, because that meant to me that they had a vision that aligned with my values. I didn't have to sell that part to somebody and hope that they got it. Yeah.
That's I don't know. Yeah, it's interesting to hear, because from the other perspective, it's just been interesting to navigate. Wanting to work with experts, and to that end, I think I don't remember if it was specific. It might have even been specifically, hey, I would like to introduce us to you because you had done that work with singing in VR. I think that might have been like, hey, you should probably talk to this person. But it's from a technology perspective, it's kind of the same thing but flipped, where it's like, well, we have an idea of what we would like to do something, but we don't really know if it's a good idea without talking to people who actually work in this field. So it's a little bit of like kind of the same thing. It's like I don't want to necessarily try to sell them on it as much as just see if there's people who already think it's a possible. Because if we're constantly trying to sell the folks on it that we want to work with, yeah, I don't know. Like, are we? Do they really think it's possible, or are we just trying to convince them it's possible? I don't know.
I mean, yeah, that's we had. I forgot about that piece. It was like at COVID, so I had done a small project with some older adults at a facility that had VR headsets, and we had tried some music therapy, and then the person we know collectively had known about both of our endeavors.
So that's actually a perfect segue because, part of our research has been focused on older adults with mild cognitive impairment and using VR Singing Club and music therapy and virtual reality together as a tool to, improve their wellness, potentially, delay, cognitive deficits. So what was kind of the turning point, and for Dr. Rushing, for you to work with us, and Richard, for you to kind of pursue that in a research capacity, what was kind of a key turning point in moving towards that, or what kind of key benefits did you see in creating something for that specific audience, older adults with mild cognitive impairment?
We had run research, and we had a grant from the National Science Foundation, and it was around the same time. It was during COVID, and it was around isolation and loneliness. And one of the biggest concerns after coming out of that research was the premise sounded great. Like, okay, people could connect together in virtual reality, especially if for reasons, I think like health reasons, logistical reasons, that it's hard to connect in person. Because I think all of us would agree that by and large, in-person connection is going to be the best unless there's a specific reason, like a health reason. But what do they do? So for us, it wasn't even about an intervention or an outcomes. It was like it was before that. It was just feeling like it's really hard to make things and engaging things in VR. And so is there something we could kind of anchor on? And that was around singing and some gaming, in the sense that, and it's interesting because I would love to talk about this some other time, or in 2 minutes, when you're talking about the body as it relates to musical instruments and drumming, because one of the things that I've always been interested in virtual reality is how the body is pulled into an interactive environment, whereas in other forms like gaming, if you're, say, using a controller, it's very little. I mean, there's still like haptic feedback, and there's still some, but it's mostly just your fingers interacting and then kind of being the mediator between this like digital world and you. But with VR, all of a sudden your hands are in it. But I feel like I digress there a little bit. It was a question of like, what do we build? And around that time, I think we were talking to around that time we were talking to Jess. We were talking to Amanda Glick, and it just seemed like there was this interesting avenue to go forward on, which is like, if we do singing, and I don't know when we got like really, if it was always singing or if it started with just music. Honestly, can't remember. But it was like, here we can start to have mechanics that we can kind of build around. And as we progressed in the first phase, a lot of it was so we still have this gaming element, but we really haven't done much yet in the research side, just because it was like, all right, let's do one thing to start. And we do singing, we can focus on that. And from a design perspective, it's very daunting to take off multiple kind of directions for what you're going to have as your interaction kind of foundation. So if we just said, let's start with singing, we could explore that without having to feel like we're overwhelmed with doing singing and say physical movement. And we did some of that. There was like an early prototypes that we had some more rhythmic elements, and it's still something we're super interested in, but it really came down to just singing for the this phase one. And I've honestly felt like I moved so far, I don't remember the question. So I am going to stop there. And if Jess has, I'd love to hear, from your perspective, like, yeah, I mean, basically your perspective, because also you could be like, actually, I thought we were going to do this, but then it changed, because it's a lot of exploration too. I mean, this is the first time we've ever done research with 2 different universities. And so there's so much of a learning experience. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking. So it's Jess.
Thanks. Thank you. No, that was really interesting. Because it has evolved so much.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the underlying drivers was that we were just all interested to see what's possible. And especially in this space that we all cared about, which is older adults. And for me, I think about it as like, what is the next generation of intervention capacity? And if there's people ready to build some of the things that are going to be required for that, let's jump in and explore what's possible. It might take us a really long time to figure out like what exactly are the things that need to be in place if this was to be effective. But if they're not in place at all, then we have nothing to work with. So the fact that y'all were really interested in just seeing like, is this possible? What can we do in this space? That's a healthcare driver.
What do you see as some of the like key goals or challenges in working with older adults? I think working with children or teenagers or just younger people in general probably creates a different environment, a different system than you would apply with our target audience in our research with older adults with mild cognitive impairment. How do you kind of adjust the musical setting, or what are some different ways that you approach that group?
Yeah, and we've talked about that a lot as we've developed the application, or as Richie has, like what's important to be in the space, and like we know some principles from music therapy that help with like familiarity in the tunes, age appropriateness in the tunes that increases that familiarity, keys that the music is in so that they can sing along, having enough structure so that they know what's happening. What I think they might ask about or be curious about or respond from just my own clinical experiences. So yeah, we've explored what of that can we put in there, what of that needs to be, what of that's just interesting.
Is there, I guess I'm wondering too, how could singing in a virtual space, what are some of the, like what would be the most powerful, ideal therapeutic outcome that could come from blending the music therapy in a virtual reality setting? What would you love to see out of this in terms of, clinical outcomes or just, health and wellness in general in that demographic?
Yeah, well, and one of the things that captivated me about their work as well was that they had looked into this idea of co-presence. So I think that is the thing that VR has the capacity for that other things don't as much, like it's 2-dimensional zooming and things like that. So one of the challenges in old age is isolation, which we've been talking about. and separation geographically from your support systems and your networks and your friends. And, as your friends also pass away. So can VR fill some of those gaps that can be accessed immediately instead of like, oh, maybe I'll see my son in a week, or I can sing songs with my grandkids that I taught my kids when they were young, and we can do that like right now, and then we can go somewhere together and have this meaningful experience, which we know that older adults have the capacity to interact with music, even if they weren't necessarily musicians, but a lot of them were. This generation, it's probably shifting, but a lot of the older adults were in choir. A lot of older adults sang in their homes, growing up, and to their children. So it's a familiar mechanism to interact in a way that maybe there's geographical barriers.
And I'm so happy that you mentioned that sense of co-presence, because I completely agree with everything you said, and I think that's all very core to our mission as a studio. And Richard, I'd love for you to I know we've talked about this, I think, in the first episode of our Roundtable series, but I would love for you to talk a little bit about co-presence and how that has played a role in the development of VR Singing Club and kind of the goal of our studio in general. Because I feel like that's really important, something that we've brought up a couple times as well, and kind of a driving feature that we want to focus on.
Yeah. Which I don't know. Sometimes I get so in the weeds that like I'm glad that we're having this conversation so I can remember how important it's been. Honestly, like sometimes the realities of running a studio and in this that's kind of like we're trying to straddle research and building products. Forget about some of the more important things with the day-to-day. There's so much to say, and I think it comes back to there's some terms, and they all kind of overlap, I think, and in the center of that is like a rich VR experience. So you have embodiment, you have presence, you have immersion, and I don't know. I feel like you spend enough time and you kind of just feel them. I can't even remember the definitions, except for embodiment is certainly more of like, and this is not like the Kinect, the Microsoft Kinect. Your body is kind of projected into the game because it's tracking you. So it's not specific to VR, but they overlap in that with the immersion and the presence, especially because you're seeing, and really it's magical because I guess it is a lot. It's not a lot. It's not a lot in the sense that all really happening is like the image that your eyes are seeing is believable, and your movement of your neck is basically 1-to-1. So like as you look to your right, your eyes believe what it sees and it tracks correctly. Because like if it was really slow and laggy, then your brain would be like, something's wrong here. Because in the real world, like your neck and your eye muscles, everything's fine-tuned. So it's real quick to realize something's wrong. But as soon as like you get over some threshold and all of a sudden the brain's like, okay, this is real. Like higher level of consciousness is like, this isn't real. But like some level of the visual system is like, yeah, this is cool. I don't see any red flags. And so like the brain at some point is starting to feel in this, feel present in this other place. And then when you have like controllers and the fact that your head is tracked, now your body is feeling like it's there to a certain degree, like not the whole body most of the time because there's not enough trackers. But even with a few things like controllers, you start to feel like you can touch this world. So that's all for the person. But then if you feel that way as an individual, and if someone else feels that way as an individual, well, why can't we feel like we're in that world together? And that's where the co-presence comes in, which is like, and honestly, I feel like it's a field that, or it's an area that is still, there's not that much research, I think. I mean, I think some of what we're doing is like, is that, and then a lot of the other research isn't formal research. It's more of just lessons learned from people building things where multiple people are together. Like, I don't even know if there's any existing research, which I would love to do, but we're also not exactly in the 100% research realm. So, you know, like, we would collaborate with Jess or somebody, but like, does playing a game together enhance the feeling of being co-present versus just talking? My hypothesis, if that, you know, is yes, totally. Like, if you're playing basketball in VR, you're going to feel more connected to the world and the other person than if you're chatting. We actually did a little bit of that in SF stuff. We had some like activities that people did. So I guess for us, there's just a belief that there is something about VR that has that much higher level of co-presence, and that to Jess's point about something like Zoom provides certain ways of interacting, and VR provides others, and Zoom provides much more higher fidelity, like bandwidth to see facial expression, to see the visual representation of a person, so I can see how you feel, that all that communication comes through. You don't get that in VR, but in VR, there is this feeling of like being next to someone, and that seems, if we can harness that in a way to provide, to help with things like isolation and loneliness and other, and then as part of other outcomes or projects, then it seems like it's incredibly valuable, because ultimately it's like, it's not that you never use Zoom anymore, unless it gets to the point that they merge. But I mean, at that point, it's kind of just reality. So we've manufactured a full other reality.
There you go.
Probably solve lots of problems at that point. That I'm not sure we're going to get there. But like, it's another avenue, and they're both are necessary. That is the take on it.
No, thank you for diving into that, because I do think that all of the different elements that we're bringing in, you know, we talked a little bit about this in our last episode with Dr. Glick about the neuroscience behind co-presence, how our brains are actively perceiving the reality that's being put in front of you. So, Dr. Rushing, do you think that music is something that could just enhance that co-presence? You know, it's like singing alone or singing with the choir, I think activates different parts of us, that when you put that combined with, you know, a more realistic, you know, the head tracking, the immersiveness of virtual reality, what is your opinion on the, you know, impact of that on co-presence and that feeling of togetherness?
Yeah, I think making music with people is a really powerful collective experience.
Yeah, 100%. So this question is for both of y'all. But last year, VRTogether, our studio, we received a small business innovation research grant from the National Institute of Aging. You might have heard that mentioned in a couple of our previous episodes. Part of that project involved gathering insights from individuals with mild cognitive impairment and their caregivers, utilizing a testing version of VR Singing Club. So I'm interested to hear from both of y'all, you know, obviously just from your, you know, clinical standpoint and your expertise, but also Richard from the game development side. What were some really interesting findings or indicators for the benefits of the music therapy and then, you know, the game development that you saw from that experience? And Dr. Rushing, if you want to go first.
I think we're still analyzing that a bit. We've done a few of the dyads, but we're still recruiting and running people through that experience.
Or I guess I should say, what are some exciting developments or any, you know, indicators for future outcomes that you might be seeing at this point? Or you can just talk about the experience itself and kind of how that has been as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been, from what I've seen, which is not all of what's been done so far, is it's feasible, and I like that's part of the point of the grant. Like, is this even feasible? Like, can something be created? And people, they're doing it. They're having interesting experiences with it. We have more information about like what to lean into or what's not necessary. So I think it'll be really cool to see where it can go from here. But I am optimistic about that the experience is valuable.
And Richard, your
I wish I could say more. I feel like I haven't seen enough yet and synthesized what I have seen.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
I love that answer because it's so on point with my experience now, having worked with researchers for a while. Like, I mean, not as like just as a purely kind of coming to understand how other people approach. I mean, how to put it? While the fact that we're doing research, I guess with a capital R, I would say, in the sense that we have people who understand this process, who have experience with this, that we have an IRB in place, like we're establishing that we're ethical in what we're doing, and we're having other people review that protocol to make sure that we are ethical. Underneath that, like, you know, a collaborative project is a collaborative project. But it's quite interesting when you have people coming from different areas, and it's necessary for us to come from this different areas. So it's a challenge, but it's a necessary challenge, because without folks like Jess, we would have no idea how to do the capital R research. We'd just be building a game. But coming to learn, like, that kind of response, like, we don't have the information yet to really say much. I would probably, not in this scenario, but I'd be more gallivanting or gung-ho or I can't think of the right term or something about things, and it's good that the team has a nice makeup of folks, so that that's not the case. I've also learned, like, that's kind of part of research, and how it proceeds, which has been interesting. And actually, to segue into the question, like, again, with feasibility, I think one of the biggest things that we didn't necessarily write in the grant, but we've learned and has been a huge part of it, is the process. Not of necessarily running the dyads, although that's been really huge, because it's been a challenge to recruit folks. Like, there's a lot of things that we've had to navigate, but just a broad process of assembling the team and working together. What we've learned now, we can infuse into a phase 2, which hopefully we get. I would love to get it, because I feel like we've just scratched the surface of what the app even looks like. There's so many things that have been learned from conversations that I would love to have time to explore and build out with another phase of research. But also, like, having that process. So it just, I guess in the simplest form, it's kind of like, I want to do it all again, but know everything that we know, because I feel like we could be, I don't know, it's not like efficient. It's more, I don't know what it's just more, maybe better with unearthing the things that are really important and those gems of knowledge from every body on the team. And so there's a lot of time that was spent learning how to manage and run a process. And now with Pat, we can spend more time on, like, what if we build 3 iterations of this one part of this idea and structure it to have just small groups of people go through it and give us feedback, or run another larger group. I just feel like there's so much that we've learned now that we could go into it and say, we're going to do this because we learned this. We're going to do this because we learned this. And that's been incredibly eye-opening, valuable, but also eye-opening, because, again, like, I don't know. I feel like we should we should write some papers about just the process of this, as opposed as well as some of the outcomes or the findings. It's just like,
well, I think that's completely. I mean, I think that is the aim of the SBIR. You know, this is not an outcome study. It is the process. It is like, so that is our aim, and we are doing it to be able to have a foundation for what could potentially be next.
And that's a perfect segue into, we are coming up on time, so I wanted to ask each of you, as we are learning about the things that will set the foundation for what is next, what would you envision is next? What do you see as the future of virtual reality and music therapy, or the introduction of virtual reality into healthcare as a therapeutic practice? Kind of what, if we're putting on our visionary hats, what kind of would you see as the next phase of growth and adoption of this technology into your spaces?
Well, I'm excited to have like a conversation after we look through the experiences that people are having with what has been developed so far, and just getting into like what do we think of that? How did it go? What do we think? What do we want to do next? I think Richie probably has spent more time thinking about it than me at this point.
Maybe, probably. I just spent a lot of time thinking about what's next. I mean, specifically to like, I guess getting back to the process part, specifically what to build is less. I mean, there's ideas there, but I think it's more of like, I want to go through that data, and I want to hear from Jess and Amanda and their insights and to really guide that. But what I don't know if this is even an answer. I just hear these conversations, and I just want to build things and put one thing that's really made a difference in phase one was what happened when we took what we built, and then we had a grant from the state as well, and we took that and we modified it and put it out just on the storefront. And I would love to figure out how we can do that, but more intertwined between the research and the stuff. Like, I would love to build a few different things and put them out there into the world, but then collect data in a way that is with our research collaborators, because for the most part, the way we did it this time was we kind of had the research track, and we had like a product, and there were reasons that we did it that way, because the research was kind of in stone already. The product was because we got a grant after all that money and project was rolling, and we're like, oh, we could use this to do this specifically to kind of get insight into the commercialization side, because ultimately SBIRs are about commercialization of our project. And we are a company, we need to make enough money to survive. But and honestly, it's some of what we've been talking about today that makes me think that I would love to try to see how we could explore that. And honestly, I don't even know more of what that looks like or means, but if we could build a number of things, I think that would be I think it would just be a really interesting way to continue both sides of it more integrated together. The one thing I've learned about and I'll be quiet because we have like 1 minute, is is like the research side is slower than the potentially a commercialization side. There's difference if you're going through like healthcare and insurance, and that can be really slow. So how can we just have those like really working together?
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. The future is very open. Thank you so much, Dr. Rushing, for joining us, and Richard, as always. If you're interested in seeing what we decide to move forward to in the future, you can subscribe to our channel as well as join our email list below to stay up to date with everything new from our studio. Thank y'all so much for joining. Appreciate you.